Hello there, everyone. I'm Gaylen Morse, and welcome to Journey to Recovery. It's great having you along today. Our podcast today is Recognizing Relapse Points, Part 2. On today's program, we'll talk with Dr. Hal Baumchen about identifying situations and circumstances that lead to relapse, and then focus on specific ways to reduce relapse potential. Thanks for being with us today. Our podcast focuses on the co-occurring disorders of mental health and substance abuse. We present a wide range of thought-provoking, hopeful, and positive topics from a clinical yet practical perspective. We provide a solid, truly integrated co-occurring disorder resource you can use in your treatment program or in your own recovery. Our host is Dr. Hal Baumchen, a licensed clinical psychologist and a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. He's the executive director of Northland Counseling Services and the clinical director of North Star Regional Co-occurring Disorder Treatment Programs. He is an author, a speaker, and clinician with over 30 years of counseling experience. I'm here today with Tim Bode, operations director at Northland Counseling Services, and with Dr. Hal Baumchen, our host at Journey to Recovery. Hello, guys.
Hello, Gaylen. Nice to see you today.
Hey, Gaylen.
Likewise.
So we started last time talking through some relapse points and looked at situational variables and intrapersonal things and intrapersonal elements that might trigger relapse potential. And we're going to talk through some of those things today. How are you doing, Tim?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
All right.
So as you said, today we're going to talk about identifying situations and circumstances that might lead to relapse and about specific ways that we can reduce relapse potential. And this is a continuation of what we started last week on our podcast. So today we'll talk about 12 specific relapse points.
Now, these 12 are areas that you could be forewarned about, maybe be on guard, expect some triggers or cues because of those certain situations or those elements that we're going to talk through. They almost inevitably predict relapse. And if you're not careful and you don't guard against them, you could be in a world of hurt here.
Mm-hmm. You know, as we get going here, Dr. Hal, could you get us started with a definition of relapse?
I think we talked about this last time on the show, Gaylen, but relapse is a return to previous level of use or having that illness return again. It's a return to that former sickness, that former illness, or those symptoms become worse again after you've had a period of improvement. Additionally, relapse can describe a return to a bad condition or a destructive form of behavior.
So as we talked about last time, you can't have a relapse if you haven't had a length of recovery or sobriety.
Tim, some treatment professionals and writers believe that a relapse is a naturally occurring part of treatment or part of recovery. Rather than see it as a part of recovery that you can expect to happen, I'd rather see it as a component that we're working hard to prevent from happening.
So let's take a look at those 12 areas that you mentioned.
Why don't we start with emotional triggers?
Having increased anxiety, depression, or other mental health problems certainly can increase the urge to use in order to try to escape or bring yourself a sense of comfort or reduce some kind of emerging symptom from occurring. I want you to be on guard for increased stress and the resulting feelings of being overwhelmed or worried or frustrated. Those kinds of things seem to be triggers for wanting to escape, a trigger for relapse.
And in order to guard against this trigger, you'd have to continue to work on managing stress without giving yourself permission to use drugs and alcohol again.
Right, and quit screaming at the people that you love, like, Tim, you've got to provide me situations where I never get stressed. You got to provide me a situation where I don't feel hopeless or I'm never irritated. No, you're going to have to guard against that yourself. You're going to have to work down your own sense of anxiety, your own symptoms of depression. Don't make somebody else do that. You manage those symptoms. You manage your own frustration and anger. Now, this is where treatment can really help. Ask yourself, what skills or tools do you need to regularly employ to successfully manage your emotions and sustain your recovery. This would entail finding ways to manage your anxiety, identify and treat symptoms of depression, and manage emotional outbursts more effectively.
This doesn't sound like a simple endeavor.
No, I wish it was. Like, here's your pill, or here's one thing to try. You need to practice these skills. If you were playing the guitar, I know you play the guitar. I think you do too, Gaylen.
Yep.
Yeah, and I play guitar. So we've all had to practice till your fingers were sore. And recovery's a lot like that. You're not going to just learn something by hearing it once. You've got to put it into practice. And they tell me that if you want to remember something, you really need to practice it within 24 hours of hearing it. So you wrote it down, you tried to retain it, you tried to recall it, but now you got to practice it right away.
How about relational triggers?
Being around using friends, even if you don't intend to use, can often lead to a compromising situation.
Yes, so consider hanging out with sober friends who support your recovery, and be extremely cautious when you're in contact with your using friends in their environment.
That's right. Find several people who are good supporters of your recovery, and maybe put some limits on those who don't support you.
You know, this seems like a pretty big area with potential for more than a few problems. Would you consider this to be a major concern for people in recovery?
It's the big one. They talk about, my guys in the residential treatment center, they talk about this all the time, who they have to avoid and who is going to be difficult to avoid because you work with the guy or you're married to him or her. And so it's very difficult to put limits, but where you can, let's put some limits and be careful about who you hang out with. That's going to be a big area of relapse potential. And if you're trying to guard your recovery, this is important.
How about situational triggers?
Drinking and drug use are often associated with places and particular events, so that would be a situational trigger.
Even after you've been sober for some time, revisiting old places can be an almost instant cue or trigger to use again. So you'll have to plan again. If you're going to a concert or a party or a sporting event where use or abuse of drugs and alcohol is associated, consider taking a sober friend along. Don't go alone. Things like snowmobiling, ice fishing, golfing, tailgating at a football game, and camping are often like triggers to use. Like, I don't go camping to go camping. I go camping to go drinking. I don't go snowmobiling to go snowmobiling. I go snowmobiling to go drinking. If that was true for you, you're going to have to be very careful of these situational cues.
So ask yourself, what situations or specific places are cues or triggers for you to use again, and what can you do to safeguard your recovery?
Sometimes you just can't return to those hobbies or activities.
Right.
How about using other substances?
Now you've made a commitment to stop using methamphetamine or heroin or cocaine, but hey, I don't have a problem with beer or alcohol, so I'm just going to drink. But that can be a real dangerous, slippery slope. Watch for those exceptions and excuses, such as I'll just have one or two, or beer was never my problem. And substituting any other substance for your drug of choice may be an almost instant trigger for relapse. Don't fall for this common self-deception. Sometimes people drink a couple of beers thinking I can get away with that, or a couple of drinks. But the problem with drinking 2 drinks of alcohol is even after 2 or especially 3 drinks, judgment is impaired. So when you were sober, you said, I'm just going to have 1 or 2. When you've had 2 or 3, now judgment is already mildly impaired. Hey, would you like to have another one? Suddenly that becomes a great idea, where when you were sober, that was dumb. You weren't going to do that.
Yeah, so that common self-deception is that I can use once in a while, or I can use a non-preferred drug, or I can go back to alcohol only, but those get people into a host of problems.
Absolutely.
So think about what common exceptions or excuses you use and how you can stay true to your commitments.
I run across this every day, Tim, where these exceptions and excuses are sort of built in and they come out automatically. So you really be aware of these things. They're important.
How about rehearsing past mistakes?
Boy, I can do this.
Yeah, so reviewing the faults, setbacks, and difficulties you've had in the past brings increased shame, guilt, and condemnation, and really can greatly complicate a person's addiction problems.
That's right. As a metaphor, I like to think of sitting in the driver's seat of an automobile. In front of you is this great big windshield, and that's that's where you're headed. You should be focused on that. Looking in the rear view mirror shows you where you have been. And as we drive, we occasionally look at that rear view mirror, that make a little backward glance to see where we've been. However, we spend most of our time looking forward into the widescreen, which reveals where we're headed. In the same way, spend most of your time looking forward into the future rather than endlessly staring back at the past and reviewing the problems that you've had. That's just going to get you in trouble, and in fact create so much angst you're going to want to use to escape that.
So one good way to do this is to list several future sober goals or future sober events that you're looking forward to.
Yeah, you're using that good language. We're looking forward to that. Those are the things to go over.
Right.
Something along the same line is having euphoric recall.
Yeah, so this term refers to romanticizing the good times.
Do you remember a story in the Bible where the people were held captive for 400 years in Egypt, and then when they get out, they're like, hey, do you remember how big those onions were? Like, did you forget 400 years of slavery? And we look only at the good times, only at the good things that happened when we were using, so be very careful of that euphoric recall. Idealizing and recalling past drunken or high states can be triggering for many people. It's a process that minimizes the long-term harsh consequences associated with drug and alcohol addiction, and it glamorizes the short-term high. Physiologically, the body responds to that memory of drug use, which in turn intensifies the urge and craving to use again. In addiction, there's this kind of dopaminergic rush, like, wow, that was great. And then glutamate, which is another hormone or another chemical in the central nervous system, dopamine says, like, wow, that was fantastic. And glutamate says, I'm going to remember that. That was great. So you have to be careful of what's happening physiologically as well.
Mm-hmm. And it can also be destructive just to listen to someone actively engaging in that euphoric recall.
Or when our clients watch a scene in a movie that's sort of glamorizing drug use and that sort of thing. You have to be very careful. You get triggered by those things.
Mm-hmm. So think about how likely you are to engage in euphoric recall and list several ways you can get back to the truth or resist the urge to replay those chemical use memories.
Even get a nag buddy or an accountability partner that can tell you to, like, hey, rein that in. You're starting to talk about the old times again.
Another item, feeling complacent. After putting so much time and effort into becoming sober and engaging positively in your recovery process, it kind of makes sense that some people would begin to feel comfortable, even overly confident.
Right. Although it's a wonderful part of the recovery process to affirm and encourage yourself and to receive those compliments and affirmations from other people, it's necessary to balance this out with some humility and caution. You get a little proud here, you're going to let your guard down, you're going to quit putting in the energy you need to.
Yeah, believing that you've done enough may cause you to reduce the efforts that have brought about your current level of health, healing, and recovery. So don't give up and don't let up.
So when a football team starts winning a few games in a row, then sometimes they get a little complacent or overconfident or cocky and arrogant. You have to be careful of that, even in your recovery.
Mm-hmm. Even I've seen it in a particular game. In one game, you get ahead, and then there's kind of this letdown.
You let down, yeah.
Yep, and you think, oh, we're doing great here. We don't have to try as hard anymore.
So you might want to ask the members of your group how you're doing with feeling complacent or overconfident, and what changes might be helpful to you to keep your guard up.
How about exhaustion or fatigue? Everyone gets tired.
Right. And when you do become exhausted, find ways to relax, de-stress, and rest. Pushing too hard may have inevitable consequences of fatigue, burnout, and relapse.
Sometimes, Tim, I hear somebody say, I'm just doing as much as I can. Doing as much as you can is similar to driving your car on the freeway as far as you can in terms of fuel economy, and then running out of fuel on the freeway. This would be poor planning on the part of the driver. Perhaps the driver should have planned for refueling and pulled over before the car ran out of gas. Likewise, anticipate the need for rest and relaxation. Don't just do as much as you possibly can. Why don't you pull over and refuel before you're completely exhausted?
So achieving a balance between resting and productivity following sobriety can be difficult. List 3 ways you can rest, relax, or recharge.
What do you do to relax, Gaylen?
Actually, what I mainly do to relax, have this big TV over in the corner that I play race car driver on. Yes.
Tim, what do you do to relax?
I listen to music, I think, is how I like to relax.
Right.
I find it calming and soothing a lot of times.
So the point here is to find something that you can do and suddenly playing a video game or even doing a house project or listening to music, suddenly that becomes therapeutic. Do that as part of your recovery program. Don't minimize the importance of that.
The next area is reemerging denial. So even after you've achieved some sobriety, you may begin to have these creeping doubts that you ever had an alcohol or drug problem to begin with.
Or you may believe that you no longer have difficulty, and now you can control your use, or just have one.
Boy, that's a trap, isn't it? This minimization, rationalization, and denial process can cause you to underestimate problems and overestimate your abilities and decrease your effort to maintain that sobriety. We talked about that earlier, where you let your guard down.
So think about, without evoking more shame or guilt, how you can stay realistic about the problems you face.
What am I facing, and what do I need to do, and be realistic about that.
Another area would be self-pity.
Where you're feeling sorry for yourself or getting impatient if things don't go your way or in accordance with your own time frame. And that can trigger relapse as well. You might begin to believe that you worked too hard and you were overlooked and you were unappreciated and you were treated unfairly, and that brings about that feeling of self-pity and I deserve better treatment than this. That can trigger use or relapse.
Cause resentment, bitterness, become a highway, really, back to justifying use.
Yeah. Like no exits. I'm just straight into relapse now because I'm ticked off. I've got those resentments, those growing frustrations and irritations. So ask yourself, what changes in your thinking could you make that are going to help you reduce those irritations and frustrations and stay on course?
The next area is addiction transfer. We know that relapse potential goes up if you trade one of your drug and alcohol addictions for something else.
Because you've used alcohol or drug addiction in the past to comfort yourself or escape emotional problems, it's just tempting to continue to look to other addictions to supply that needed escape or some comfort. Common substitutions include compulsive gambling, compulsive sexuality, overeating, oversleeping, even overworking. Find healthy and socially acceptable ways to work through problems and comfort yourself rather than getting back into some other bad habit or addiction substitution.
Ask yourself, what other addictions have you had in the past? What addictions or bad habits are you vulnerable to now? And what could you do to safeguard your sobriety?
So we see some of that addiction trading where I gambled in the past and then I quit gambling, but then I started drinking and then I quit drinking and I started just using methamphetamine. And now you're done with the methamphetamine, you're in treatment. There's a temptation to want to go back to gambling. So be aware of that.
Another area would be money. You know, as they finish a treatment program, many people are looking forward to working again, earning a living, and having some cash on hand.
No, that certainly is a respectable goal, yet it can provide huge temptations to go places, be with people, and do things that move them toward relapse. Consider ways to have money, but use it responsibly.
So ask yourself, what financial goals do you have following treatment? And what financial difficulties do you face? What are some ways you can protect yourself from overspending or spending money on the wrong things?
Now, with some forethought and planning, many of these tempting situations that we discussed here today can be avoided. But don't let your guard down. Stay in touch with somebody who's supportive of your recovery. Find some sober friends. Now, recognizing these relapse points and understanding your vulnerability can further your chances at being successful and finding a fulfilling and lifelong recovery.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to today's podcast. Today, we're talking about recognizing relapse points and how to safeguard your recovery. Also, we invite you to check out resources on the web at journeytorecovery.com. There you can download other materials that help you identify triggers to use drugs and alcohol and develop skills to identify emotional problems, reduce symptoms, and prevent relapse. You can find those materials at journeytorecovery.com. We've been visiting with author, speaker, and clinical psychologist Dr. Hal Baumchen. I'm Gaylen Morse. Thanks for listening to today's program. See you next time on Journey to Recovery. Remember, recovery is a journey. Enjoy the ride.